We were certain the humans would die first. That was the consensus whispered through the neural channels of the High Conclave before their vessel had even breached our orbital perimeter. A low-threat species, the report said. Soft, fragile, evolutionarily incomplete. Their world, we were told, had forged creatures that survived not through strength, but through persistence. To us, persistence was meaningless. In a galaxy ruled by force, persistence only delayed extinction. I remember the moment their ship entered our space. It was unimpressive. No visible weapons arrays, no energy signatures indicative of defensive shielding beyond the bare minimum required for interstellar travel. Even its hull composition suggested compromise, lightweight alloys where hardened plating should have been. The Zarkathi warlords laughed openly. Their kind respected only dominance, and this was not dominance. One of them projected across the chamber, his armored limbs grinding against one another in amusement. The Varelians responded with pulses of electric blue light, our translation systems interpreting their reaction as mockery layered with curiosity. And I recorded everything, because that was my purpose. I am not a warrior. I am not a diplomat. I am an observer of the High Council, tasked with witnessing history as it unfolds and preserving it without bias. I have seen civilizations rise in brilliance and fall in fire. I have watched species exterminate themselves over misunderstandings that could have been resolved with a single conversation. And yet, nothing in my cycles of observation prepared me for the humans. Their vessel docked with mechanical precision. No flourish, no display, just quiet efficiency. The chamber dimmed slightly as the atmospheric seals engaged. Hundreds of representatives from across known space turned their attention toward the entry corridor. The air itself seemed to tighten, charged with anticipation and restrained hostility. War was already inevitable. This gathering, this so-called conclave, was merely the final formality before the galaxy tore itself apart once again. And into that tension walked a human. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. The figure was smaller than I expected. Not weak, just compact. Their form lacked the exaggerated traits common among dominant species. No natural armor, no visible weaponry, no biological enhancements designed for combat. Their skin, exposed, seemed vulnerable to even minor environmental hazards. This was the representative? A murmur rippled through the chamber. Not fear, not even concern. Dismissal. But then, I noticed something else. The human was not alone. Behind them, exactly one step back and slightly to the side, stood another. The bodyguard. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about this second figure. Their attire was simple, dark, unadorned, absorbing the ambient light rather than reflecting it. No insignias, no visible rank, no weapons.
But unlike the diplomat, this one did not move. Not even slightly. Most species, when entering the conclave, display some form of instinctual reaction, posturing, scanning, subtle shifts in stance that reveal readiness for conflict. Even the most disciplined among us betray something, a flicker of tension, a measurable increase in neural activity. The human bodyguard exhibited none. They stood as though carved into existence, still, silent, unyielding. I adjusted my sensory focus, directing additional processing toward them. My instruments registered life signs, steady, controlled, almost unnaturally consistent. No spikes in stress, no fluctuations in awareness. It was as if they had already calculated every possible outcome and found none worth reacting to. That was the first moment I felt it. Not fear, not yet, but something unfamiliar. The diplomat stepped forward, acknowledging the assembly with a slight inclination of their head, a gesture of respect, or perhaps something else. Confidence, without arrogance. It was disarming. "Why are you here?" the Zarkathi warlord demanded, his voice reverberating through the chamber like distant thunder. The human diplomat met his gaze and smiled. It was not a defensive expression, nor submissive. It was calm. "Yes," the human said, their voice steady, unamplified, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. Laughter erupted, harsh, metallic, electric.
dozens of species expressing disbelief in their own ways. Even I recorded the moment as statistically significant, a unified reaction across hostile factions. Rare. The human did not react. Neither did the bodyguard. Time passed, measured not in cycles, but in tension. Accusations resumed. Territorial disputes reignited. Old grievances surfaced with renewed intensity. The fragile threads holding the conclave together began to snap, one by one. I had seen this pattern before. This was how wars began. A misinterpreted statement, a perceived insult, a single act of aggression that cascaded into total annihilation. It was inevitable, and still, the human remains still, listening, watching, waiting. The bodyguard had not moved since entering the chamber. Not a shift in posture, not a glance, nothing. We thought it was fear. We thought they were overwhelmed. We thought they had finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. We were wrong. The turning point came suddenly, as it always does. A Virelian delegate surged forward, their bioelectric field flaring violently, an unmistakable sign of imminent attack. At the same time, the Zarkathi warlord raised one of his massive limbs, plasma conduits igniting along its surface. Two aggressors, two different species, one shared intention. Violence. The chamber erupted into motion. Defensive systems began to activate. Guards shifted into combat stances. Energy signatures spiked across every measurable spectrum. I prepared to record the first strike, because once it began, it would not stop.
My sensors locked on to the human diplomat, still calm, still composed. And then, they moved. Not to defend themselves, not to flee, but to do something far more subtle. They turned their head, just slightly, and looked at the bodyguard. No words were exchanged, no signal was transmitted, but something passed between them. Something silent, something absolute. For the first time since entering the chamber, the bodyguard moved. And in that instant, I realized with a clarity that froze every processing function I possessed, we had not invited a fragile species into the conclave. We had invited something else entirely, something we did not understand, something we were not prepared for. And as the first weapon reached full charge, the galaxy held its breath. The first strike never should have surprised us, and yet it did. Because even though every predictive model had confirmed it, even though every historical precedent pointed toward inevitable violence, there was always that fleeting, irrational hope that this time would be different. It never was. The Zarkathi warlord moved first. His kind always did. Massive, plated limbs surged forward, each step sending vibrations through the conclave floor. Plasma conduits ignited along his arm, glowing brighter with every fraction of a second. The sound they emitted was unmistakable, a rising, unstable hum that signaled catastrophic release. Around him, others followed. The Virelian delegate unleashed a burst of bioelectric energy, arcs of blue lightning snapping outward in chaotic patterns. Defensive drones activated midair, their targeting arrays locking on anything that moved. Across the chamber, multiple species reached for weapons, some visible, others concealed within their own biology. This was the moment, the beginning of another war. I shifted fully into recording mode, diverting all cognitive processes toward documentation. Every frame, every signal, every fluctuation in energy, captured for the archives. Because this was how civilizations ended. And in the center of it all, the human did not move. Not the diplomat. Not yet. They stood exactly as before, unarmored, unguarded, surrounded by entities capable of tearing them apart in less than a breath. Their expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, unafraid. It was illogical.
Every survival instinct across known species dictated one response to imminent annihilation: react, defend, escape. But the human simply observed. And then they gave a nod. It was so small that, under normal circumstances, it would have gone unnoticed. A slight dip of the head, a subtle shift in posture. But I saw it, because I was watching them, because something about them demanded attention. That single gesture was permission. The bodyguard moved. No, that is inaccurate. Movement implies transition, a beginning and an end, a path that can be traced, measured, understood. What I witnessed had none of those qualities.
One moment, the bodyguard was standing still. The next, the Zarkothi warlord's plasma lance was gone. There was no visible motion between those states, no blur, no distortion. My sensors, calibrated to track relativistic projectiles, registered nothing, only the result. The weapon clattered across the floor, sliding to a halt meters away from its wielder. The warlord froze. Confusion rippled through his neural output, spiking into something dangerously close to fear. Then came the second moment. The Virelian's bioelectric surge collapsed instantly, as if severed at its source. Their luminous form flickered violently before dimming to a weak, unstable glow. Their attack neutralized. 2 seconds had passed. 3 additional aggressors fell in rapid succession. A towering Kethral enforcer, known for crushing armored transports, found itself immobilized, its limbs locked at precise angles that rendered movement impossible without self-destruction. A swarm of microdrones, released as a last resort defense mechanism, disassembled mid-flight, each unit falling apart into harmless fragments before completing a single attack vector. A concealed weapon embedded within the exoskeleton of a Heraxian delegate was extracted before it could deploy, placed gently on the ground beside them as though removed by an unseen hand. No one saw how. We only saw that it had happened. 3 seconds. 4. 5. And then, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of intent. The chamber, moments ago teetering on the edge of total war, had frozen. Every hostile action had been interrupted, every threat neutralized, every weapon disabled, disarmed, or removed entirely. The most dangerous beings in the galaxy stood motionless, not because they were restrained, but because they did not understand what had just occurred. I scanned the bodyguard again. They had returned to their original position. Exactly. Same posture, same orientation, same controlled breathing patterns. If not for the scattered weapons and immobilized combatants, there would have been no evidence that anything had happened at all. This defied analysis. My systems attempted reconstruction, frame by frame, signal by signal, but there were gaps, missing data, entire sequences where cause and effect existed without any observable connection. It was as though reality itself had been edited. The Zarkothi warlord finally moved. Slowly, carefully. He looked down at his empty limb, then toward the weapon lying far beyond his reach. His armored plating shifted, grinding softly as he recalibrated stance, not for attack, but for understanding. What? His voice faltered, something I had never recorded from his species before. No one answered, because no one knew. The Virelian attempted to reinitiate their bioelectric field. It sparked weakly, unstable, incomplete, before collapsing again. Their systems had not been destroyed. They had been interrupted. Precisely. Deliberately. Reversibly. That was when the realization began to spread. Not through words, but through silence. The human bodyguard had not attacked. They had not retaliated. They had not even escalated. They had simply ended the conflict before it could begin. I felt something then. A sensation I had not experienced in all my cycles as an observer. Uncertainty. Because this did not align with any known model of warfare. This was not dominance. This was not defense. This was something else entirely. Something more controlled, more refined, more
intentional. The human diplomat finally moved. They stepped forward, placing themselves between the immobilized aggressors and the rest of the chamber. Their gaze swept across the assembly, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling: expectation. As though this outcome had always been inevitable, as though there had never been any other possibility. No one responded, because no one could. The evidence was undeniable. In less than 5 seconds, the war had been stopped. Not paused, not delayed, stopped. And the one responsible stood quietly behind the diplomat, once again motionless, watching, waiting, as if prepared to do it all again. But that was not the most terrifying realization. No, that came next. As my systems continued to analyze the data, reconstructing fragments of what had occurred, a pattern began to emerge. Partial, incomplete, but enough. The bodyguard had not used maximum force, not even close. Every action had been measured, calculated, reduced to the absolute minimum required to achieve the desired outcome. No fatalities, no permanent damage, no excess, just precision. Which meant this was not their full capability. This was restraint. And if this was restraint, then what, I wondered, would happen if they ever chose to stop holding back? History does not often announce the moment it is rewritten. It does not arrive with ceremony, nor does it pause to ensure it is understood. Most of the time, it passes unnoticed, its significance only revealed long after the damage has been done. But this was different. We knew, in the silence that followed, that something irreversible had just occurred. The chamber did not erupt back into chaos. It did not fragment into renewed aggression or defensive panic. Instead, it froze. Every delegate, every warlord, every machine intelligence present in the conclave remained perfectly still, as if motion itself had become a risk none were willing to take. And for the next 3 minutes, the galaxy tried to understand. My system surged beyond standard operational thresholds. Data streams flooded in from every available sensor: visual, thermal, electromagnetic, subneural. External satellites synchronized with internal recording arrays. Even personal implants, embedded within the minds of certain delegates, began transmitting fragmented recollections in an attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events. It was unprecedented. Never before had so many independent systems focused on a single moment in time with such urgency. And yet, the result was failure. Not partial failure, not incomplete analysis. Total failure. There were gaps. Not minor inconsistencies or corrupted frames, but entire sections of time where events had clearly occurred without any observable cause. The Zarkathi warlord's weapon did not appear to be taken. It simply was no longer there. The Virelian's energy field did not collapse gradually. It existed, and then it did not. The defensive drones, mid-activation, transitioned from lethal configuration to inert debris without any detectable interference signal. Cause and effect had been severed, or perhaps compressed beyond our ability to perceive. I attempted to isolate the bodyguard within every available frame, to track their position across time, to map movement vectors, predict trajectories, reconstruct intent. But the data resisted. In some frames, they stood exactly where they had been upon entering. In others, they were not there at all. Not moved. Not blurred. Absent. as though reality itself had briefly failed to register their existence, and then restored it. 3 minutes. That is how long the silence lasted. 3 minutes of analysis. 3 minutes of disbelief. 3 minutes in which the most advanced civilizations in existence attempted and failed to comprehend a single human. I turned my attention back to the present, because while the galaxy struggled to understand the past, the consequences were unfolding in real time. The Zarkathi warlord was on his knees, not by choice. His massive limbs, capable of crushing reinforced structures, remained locked in place. I scanned for external restraints. There were none. No visible bindings. No energy fields. Instead, the paralysis originated from within. Precise neural disruption. Temporary. Reversible. Perfectly controlled. His physiology was intact, his strength unchanged, and yet he could not move. Not because he was overpowered, but because he had been interrupted. The Virelians' delegate flickered weakly nearby. Their bioelectric systems, once surging with enough energy to incapacitate entire squads, were now unstable, fluctuating at minimal output. Again, not destroyed, adjusted, reduced to harmless levels. Around them, similar patterns emerged. Every aggressor had been neutralized, every threat eliminated, and not a single life had been taken. That was when the fear began to change. Before, it had been the fear of violence. Now, it was the fear of precision. Because destruction is easy to understand. Overwhelming force requires no explanation. It is chaotic, brutal, and most importantly, predictable. But this was something else. This was control at a level we had never encountered. Because to neutralize an enemy without killing them requires knowing exactly how much force is needed, and exactly how much is not.
Which meant the human bodyguard had assessed every individual in the chamber, every physiology, every weakness, every threshold of damage within fractions of a second, and acted accordingly. That realization spread like a silent contagion. They could have killed us, all of us, before we even realized the war had begun. The Zarkathi warlord seemed to arrive at the same conclusion. His breathing, heavy, mechanical, slowed as his neural signals stabilized, his gaze lifted, locking onto the human diplomat. For the first time since his species had entered recorded history, he did not project dominance. He asked a question. The human regarded him quietly. The answer was simple, too simple, because behind it lay something far more complex. Choice implied alternatives, and alternatives implied capability. The diplomat stepped forward again, their presence commanding attention without demanding it. "We understand conflict," they continued, their voice calm, almost gentle. "We have studied it, lived through it." Their gaze moved across the chamber, meeting the eyes, if such things could be called eyes, of every species present. For most of our history, we believed war was inevitable, that it was a natural extension of difference. A pause, not for effect, for consideration. No one interrupted. No one dared. "War is not a necessity," the human said. "It is a failure of communication, a failure of understanding." Behind them, the bodyguard remained motionless, a silent contradiction to everything we had ever believed about power. A subtle shift rippled through the chamber, not movement, realization. Another pause. The word settled heavily, because we all understood what it meant. This was not the extent of human capability. This was a controlled display, measured, limited, intentional, which meant everything we had just witnessed was only a fraction of what they could do. I felt my processing core strain under the weight of that conclusion,
because if this was not their maximum, then their maximum was beyond comprehension. The diplomat took one final step forward. "We did not come here to threaten you," they said. Their gaze hardened, not with anger, but with certainty. "You were about to start a war that would have consumed entire systems, billions of lives." Silence. 3 minutes. That was all it had taken. 3 minutes to dismantle centuries of hostility. 3 minutes to rewrite the balance of power across the galaxy. 3 minutes to prove that everything we believed about strength was incomplete. The human stepped back. The bodyguard did not move. And in that stillness, in that impossible calm, the truth became undeniable. Humans were not weak. They were not fragile. They were not insignificant. They were deliberate. And as I recorded that realization, embedding it into the archives of galactic history, I understood something else.
This moment, this precise intersection of fear, understanding, and restraint was not the end of the conflict. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because now we knew what humans were capable of. And the question that followed was far more terrifying than any war. What would they do next? Fear does not always roar. Sometimes it spreads in silence. In the cycles following the Conclave incident, no formal declarations were issued, no fleets mobilized, no retaliatory strikes were launched. And yet, across the galaxy, panic ignited. Not the chaotic panic of war, but something far more dangerous. Controlled fear, measured, calculated. The kind that forces civilizations to question everything they believe. Emergency councils convened within microcycles. Entire planetary governments diverted resources away from military operations toward analysis. Intelligence networks, once focused on enemy movements, redirected their full capacity toward a single objective: understanding humanity. Or more precisely, understanding what we had failed to see. I was reassigned almost immediately. No longer just an observer of events, but an analyst of consequence. My recordings from the Conclave were requested by no fewer than 12 dominant civilizations, each seeking clarity, each hoping to find a flaw, a limitation, a weakness that could be quantified. There was none. Every metric we relied on, physical strength, energy output, technological signature, biological resilience, had failed us completely. Because humans did not operate within those metrics, they operated beyond them. The first breakthrough came not from our own analysis, but from intercepted human transmissions. Fragments, incomplete and heavily encrypted, but enough to form patterns, enough to suggest something deeper. At first, we believed the Bodyguard was a unique entity, a singular anomaly, perhaps an elite specimen enhanced beyond standard human capability. That assumption did not survive long. The data suggested otherwise. Training protocols, behavioral conditioning, neural discipline frameworks, entire systems dedicated not to increasing destructive capacity, but to control it. That was the distinction we had missed. Other species evolved to maximize force, to strike harder, faster, more decisively. Humans evolved to limit it. I reviewed simulation after simulation, reconstructing the Conclave event under varying parameters. In every scenario, the outcome remained consistent. The Bodyguard could have escalated. They could have eliminated every threat within the chamber. The time required for total neutralization, lethal neutralization, was calculated at under 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That was all it would have taken to end every life in that room. But they had not done it. They had chosen not to. That choice became the focal point of our fear. Because restraint requires more power than destruction. Any species can annihilate an enemy if given sufficient force. But to stop at precisely the point where the enemy is neutralized, no further, no less, requires something else entirely. Control. Absolute control. More data emerged. Human combat doctrines, if they could even be called that, did not prioritize victory in the traditional sense. There were no strategies centered on domination, no doctrines built around prolonged engagement. Instead, every principle converged on a single objective: end the conflict. As quickly as possible, with the least possible cost, not just to themselves, but to everyone involved. It was incomprehensible. War, by its nature, is inefficient, chaotic, wasteful.
Entire species had built their identities around enduring that chaos, adapting to it, surviving it. Humans had done something else. They had refined it, reduced it, optimized it, until war itself became obsolete. The bodyguard was not a soldier. That term was insufficient. They were a solution, a living embodiment of everything humanity had learned about conflict, trained not just in physical engagement, but in psychology, anticipation, and outcome prediction. They did not react to threats. They prevented them. By the time an opponent decided to act, the human had already calculated and executed the resolution. This explained the gaps in our data, the missing frames, the absence of observable motion. We had been looking for action when the outcome had already been decided. That realization spread through the councils like a fracture through solid stone, because it meant one thing above all else. We had never been fighting wars efficiently. We had been prolonging them. Deliberately or not, every species in the galaxy had accepted war as a process, a sequence of escalation, adaptation, and eventual conclusion. Humans had removed the process entirely. They had reduced war to a moment, a single decisive instant in which all variables were resolved. At the time, it had sounded philosophical. Now, it sounded literal. Further transmissions confirmed what we had begun to suspect. The bodyguard at the conclave was not unique. They were standard, one of many, perhaps thousands, perhaps more, each trained to the same level of precision, each capable of the same controlled, instantaneous resolution of conflict. The implications were staggering. An army of such individuals would not wage war. They would erase it. Entire battlefields could be neutralized before a single command was issued, fleets disabled before weapon systems came online, command structures dismantled before orders could be transmitted. Not through overwhelming force, but through perfect execution. And still, they did not use it. That was the part that unsettled us most, because power in every known instance seeks expression. It demands to be proven, to be demonstrated, to be expanded. But humanity restrained it, deliberately, consistently, as if they understood something we did not, or perhaps as if they feared something we had never considered.
The High Council reconvened in secrecy. Not to plan retaliation, such an idea had become unthinkable, but to reassess our position entirely. For the first time in recorded history, war was no longer the greatest threat. Humanity was. Not because they would destroy us, but because they could, and chose not to. The distinction was critical and terrifying, because it meant they did not fear war. They had already mastered it. And when a species no longer fears its greatest weapon, it becomes something else entirely, something beyond prediction, something beyond control. I finalized my report with a conclusion I never believed I would write. Humanity has not merely adapted to war, they have solved it. And as I transmitted those findings across the network, watching as entire civilizations recalibrated their understanding of power, one question remained. If humans had truly made war obsolete, then what in all the vast expanse of the galaxy could possibly threaten them now? Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply replaces what came before. There was no declaration, no moment where the galaxy collectively agreed that everything had changed, no treaty etched into law, no unified command ordering fleets to stand down. And yet, they did. At first, it was subtle, a delay in deployment schedules, a hesitation in long-planned offensives. Border skirmishes, once inevitable, simply failed to occur. I tracked the data in real time. Military mobilizations across 12 major factions began to slow within a single cycle of the conclave incident. Not halted, not reversed, just slowed, as if the will to proceed had been interrupted. The Zarqafi, whose expansion campaigns had consumed entire systems over centuries, recalled 3 forward assault fleets without explanation. It was a lie. They had seen the same thing we all had,
and they had understood it. The Virelians followed soon after. Their bioelectric war clusters, once positioned along contested sectors, withdrew to defensive perimeters, not retreating, just no longer advancing. Even machine intelligences, entities governed by pure logic, immune to fear, adjusted their predictive models. Their calculations, once favoring escalation, now returned a different conclusion. Engagement with humanity, or any conflict that might involve them, resulted in absolute loss. Not probabilistic loss, certainty. That was the shift. Not fear of destruction, but certainty of outcome. I compiled reports from across the network, correlating behavioral changes with post-conclave analysis. The pattern was undeniable. Every species that had witnessed or even reviewed the incident reached the same conclusion. If one human could do that, then more could do worse. And if more could do worse, then war as we understood it no longer existed. Because war requires uncertainty. It requires the belief, however small, that victory is possible. Remove that belief, and conflict collapses before it begins.
That was what humanity had done. Not through threats, not through demonstrations of overwhelming force, but through a single, controlled event that revealed the truth without exaggeration. They had shown us exactly what they were capable of, and nothing more. That was the brilliance of it. Had they destroyed us, had they turned the conclave into a massacre, it would have reinforced everything we already believed: power through domination, strength through annihilation. We would have responded in kind, escalated, adapted, retaliated. But they did not. They restrained themselves, and in doing so, they removed the illusion of resistance. I reviewed countless psychological profiles in the aftermath: war-driven species, conquest-oriented civilizations, even decentralized hive intelligences. All of them exhibited the same anomaly: motivation decline, not due to loss, but due to futility. Because what is the purpose of war if the outcome is already decided? The High Council did not reconvene publicly. There was no need. Their silence spoke more clearly than any decree. Each faction returned to its own territory, its own priorities, its own internal recalculations. And yet, they all carried the same thought with them. Humans could end this, at any time, without warning, without resistance. And they chose not to. That choice became the foundation of a new power structure, not one built on dominance, but on restraint. Humanity did not expand aggressively. They did not position fleets along contested borders. They did not issue demands or ultimatums. They simply existed, present, watching, waiting, confident. That confidence was what unsettled us most, because it was not arrogance, it was certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from knowing the outcome of every possible conflict before it begins. I began to notice changes beyond military behavior. Diplomatic channels, once filled with veiled threats and strategic maneuvering, shifted in tone. Negotiations became efficient, direct. Why prolong discussions when escalation was no longer viable? Why posture when there was nothing to gain? Even long-standing rivalries began to dissolve, not out of reconciliation, but irrelevance, because against humans there would be no glory in battle, no drawn-out campaigns, no heroic last stands, no opportunity to adapt, to learn, to overcome, only an immediate, decisive end. War, for the first time in our recorded history, became pointless. And with that realization came something unexpected: relief. It was faint, subtle, almost imperceptible beneath the layers of fear and uncertainty. But it was there, because beneath every conflict, beneath every war-driven culture, there existed a truth we rarely acknowledged. War was exhausting, costly, endless. And now, it was no longer necessary. Humanity had not just changed the balance of power, they had redefined it. Power was no longer measured by how much destruction a species could unleash, but by how effectively it could prevent it. And by that measure, humans stood alone. I concluded my analysis with a projection, a model of future galactic behavior based on current trends. The result was unprecedented. Conflict rates dropped. Not to zero, but close. Localized disputes still occurred, minor skirmishes, isolated incidents of aggression. But large-scale war, system-wide devastation, multi-species conflict
declined rapidly, because every path that led there intersected with humanity. And every intersection ended the same way. Immediately. Decisively. Finally. The shift was not loud. It did not reshape the galaxy overnight, but it spread. Quietly. Inevitably. Until one day, I realized something extraordinary. We were no longer preparing for war. We were preparing to avoid it. And at the center of that transformation was a species we once dismissed as fragile. A species that had never raised its voice, never issued a threat, never demanded submission. And yet, had changed everything. Not through force, but through the undeniable presence of a truth we could no longer ignore. War, as we knew it, was over. But as I finalized that conclusion, embedding it into the historical record alongside every other impossible event I had witnessed, I found myself hesitating. Because endings are rarely as absolute as they seem. And if humanity had truly made war obsolete, then what would replace it? History has a way of labeling moments that defy understanding. It prefers dates, names, and outcomes, a neat packaging of chaos into digestible narratives. And yet, some events resist definition. The arrival of the human diplomat, the silent bodyguard, and the 3 minutes that followed, those moments would not be forgotten. Not a war, not a battle, not even a confrontation by conventional standards, but a demonstration so absolute that the galaxy could never return to its former assumptions. I observed as entire civilizations recalibrated. Military academies, once devoted to prolonged campaigns, attrition strategies, and escalation protocols, began teaching what they called human tactics. Not to replicate, not to mimic, but to understand, to comprehend a species that had reduced conflict to an exact, measurable outcome. Political doctrine shifted. Discussions of expansion, conquest, or domination became framed not in terms of force, but of consequence. Preventive diplomacy replaced aggressive posturing. Treaties were reconsidered not because they had been broken, but because they were now optional. Conflict itself had been rendered unnecessary. And yet, humans did not expand. They did not occupy or dominate. They did not manipulate or enforce compliance. They simply watched. Their fleets remained in orbit of their own systems. Their diplomats traveled cautiously. Their bodyguards, trained beyond comprehension, remained silent, restrained, vigilant. It was not absence that defined them. It was presence. And that presence carried a weight far heavier than armies. They intervened only when a threshold was truly crossed, only when inaction would result in irreversible loss. Even then, they chose the minimum necessary, the precise action required to restore balance, never more. From my vantage point, this restraint became a lesson in itself. Humans were not the strongest. They did not possess the largest fleets, the most durable biology, or the most destructive technology. And yet, they wielded power that exceeded all of these. Discipline, control, restraint. The bodyguard had demonstrated this in 3 minutes. A being capable of ending the conflict, of taking lives, of dismantling entire fleets, and choosing instead to preserve every one. That choice echoed across centuries. Species that once glorified combat began to reconsider their values. Gladiatorial arenas were decommissioned. Training regimens were rewritten. Honor, once defined by victory, was now defined by restraint. A new kind of respect emerged. Not fear, not hatred, not envy. Respect. I recorded countless instances where entire fleets hesitated at the prospect of engagement, not because of treaties, not because of orders, but because they remembered the lesson of 3 minutes. Wars that might have raged for decades never occurred. Battles that could have decimated planets were averted. Entire star systems thrived in relative peace, not through compromise, but through the unspoken understanding of consequence. Even today, in every council chamber I observe, the memory lingers. The silent bodyguard, standing motionless, waiting, watching, calculating. A symbol not of conquest, but of responsibility. They did not need to enforce dominance. They did not need to claim territory. They did not need to prove themselves in battle. Their strength was in choice. To conquer or not. To end war or to let it persist. In choosing restraint, humanity became more than a species. They became guardians. Not of territory, not of wealth, not of ideology. Guardians of peace. I observed as this principle reshaped the galaxy. Ancient rivalries softened. Long-standing alliances shifted focus from aggression to collaboration. Even species that had never known defeat learned to calculate the cost of provocation, not in lives lost, but in outcomes foregone. The galaxy became quieter, not dull, not stagnant, but measured, predictable, stable. And the architects of that new order, humans, remained elusive, not absent, not weak, just deliberate. The memory of that silent figure, the bodyguard, persisted like a shadow across every battlefield that never formed, every council meeting, every negotiation. It was a reminder that true strength is not measured in destruction. It is measured in the ability to prevent it. 3 minutes, a duration so brief it could have been missed, a span so decisive it changed the fate of the entire galaxy. No shots fired to completion, no lives lost, no war waged.
And yet, victory had been achieved, not through domination, not through annihilation, but through restraint, through calculation, through understanding. I continue to record, to observe, to archive these events, not as stories of human conquest, but as chronicles of human mastery. Because in that mastery lies the lesson for every species that will ever live. Power is not what you can destroy. Power is what you can prevent. And in that prevention, humanity became something beyond comparison. The galaxy learned a truth it had never known. Wars could end in moments. Peace could be achieved without negotiation. Life could be preserved even when survival demanded violence. All it required was a species willing to master itself, to watch, to wait, to intervene only when absolutely necessary. And in that choice, the galaxy discovered a power unlike any it had ever imagined. Silent, absolute, unassailable. The legacy of 3 minutes endured, not in monuments, not in histories of bloodshed, but in every quiet moment where conflict might have arisen, and did not. A legacy written not with weapons, but with restraint. And as I continue my observations, one fact becomes undeniable. The war ended in 3 minutes, without a single shot fired to completion, without a single life lost. A victory unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. And humanity still watches.